Have you ever wondered when the New Testament was formed? In other words, have you ever wondered when the 27 books that we see in our modern New Testament were established as an authoritative canon? The first time on record that we know of that an authority figure gave a list of authoritative texts constituting a Christian canon was in the year 367 CE by an Alexandrian bishop named Athanasius. In his 39th festal letter, he declared exactly which books were inspired divinely as canon, including both the Old and New Testaments. Athanasius gives us critical information in his letter, which I'll read to you here shortly. It's just a brief section of that entire letter. And I want to show you one of the earliest extant copies. I have it here. This is known, it's commonly cataloged as the Paris Greek 1085 manuscript. One of the earliest that still exists, although this one dates to roughly the 10th century, so still quite late. Originally written about 600 years before this copy was made. This manuscript still exists. There are other records in this manuscript, but here we see the 39th festal letter that Athanasius of Alexandria wrote, and here he starts to list the books of the canon. These are Old Testament books, and after he's done listing the Old Testament books, he starts listing the books in the New Testament, which mirror exactly what we have in our modern New Testament. Here it says the evangelists are thus, and actually I'm more well-versed in Koine Greek, not this specific type of Greek, but here we see the Gospel of Matthew is the first one he lists. So he said, according to Matthew, and then here, according to Markon, kata Markon, and then Luke, John, kata Ioanni, and the list goes on. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and I wanted to share that with you. 10th century manuscript of the 39th festal letter. You've seen it for yourselves. There are 3 other candidates for the oldest extant manuscript of the festal letter. 2 of these manuscripts are housed at the monastery of St. John the Theologian at Patmos, Fons Principal 172 and Fons Principal 173. Sorry about my French. And the other named Barocci 26, and that is at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. Currently, I am in the process of digitizing this manuscript, or attempting to digitize it. There are no images of these other candidates for the oldest extant manuscript. Right now, I'm in contact with the Bodleian Library. I have been in contact with other professors at the University of Birmingham. So stick with me. I'll tell you more information about that process. Hopefully soon I'll have an image of Barocci 26. One of the professors at Birmingham has told me that the book is bound too tightly to be able to photograph it, but we'll see what the Bodleian Library tells me. I think it would be great to digitize these manuscripts so we can look at all of the earliest candidates for this letter. If you have any contacts that might be able to help me out in this attempt, either in the monastery at Patmos or the Bodleian Library, please let me know. We can tackle this together. All right, so here's the letter. Stick with me to the end because it's really interesting. Athanasius wrote, "But since we have made mention of heretics as dead, but of ourselves as possessing the divine scriptures for salvation, and since I fear lest, as Paul wrote to the Corinthians, some few of the simple should be beguiled from their simplicity and purity by the subtlety of certain men, and should afterwards read other books, those called apocryphal, led astray by the similarity of their names with the true books." So here he's emphasizing the value of the canon, these books that he has in mind that Christians should be reading. "I beseech you to bear patiently, if I also write by way of remembrance of matters with which you are acquainted, influenced by the need and advantage of the church. In proceeding to make mention of these things, I shall adopt, to commend my undertaking, the pattern of Luke the evangelist, saying, for as much as some have taken in mind to reduce in order themselves the books termed apocryphal, and to mix them up with the divinely inspired scripture, concerning which we have been fully persuaded, as they who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word." All this written in 367 CE. "Delivered to the fathers." Sorry, I may have reduced the continuity of the text there, but I'm just saying all this was written in 367 CE. Of the word "delivered to the fathers. It hath seemed good to me also, having been urged thereto by the brethren, and having learned from the beginning to bring before you the books included in the canon, and handed down and accredited as divine, to the end that anyone who has fallen into error may correct those who have led him astray, and that he who continues steadfast in purity may again rejoice, having these things brought to his remembrance. There are then of the Old Testament in all 22 books in number. Then he lists all the books in the Old Testament. He counts some of the books in a unique way. It really depends on how you count these books. For Kings, he says there's 4 books of Kings that have been put into 2, and so that 22 number isn't mirroring our count of our Hebrew Bible, but in modernity. But the books that he lists are actually very similar to the books we have in the Old Testament. But there are differences in the Old Testament books that he lists, however, not in the New Testament. In the New Testament, they are exactly the same list that we have in our modern New Testament today. And there's very little discrepancy in the lists revered as divine in Christendom today. Then he says, but we must not look upon it as a task to speak of the books of the New Testament. That's a cheery attitude. That's cool. These then are the 4 Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Afterwards, the Acts of the Apostles and the Catholic epistles called of the Apostles, 7 in number. James, 1, of Peter, 2, of John, 3. He's saying that's the number of books that these people wrote. I'm sure he's convinced that John wrote those Catholic epistles and Peter. And then 1 of Jude. Besides these, there are 14 epistles of the Apostle Paul written in this order. The first to the Romans, then 2 to the Corinthians, after these to the Galatians, next to the Ephesians, then to the Philippians, and to the Colossians. After these, 2 to the Thessalonians, and that to the Hebrews, and again 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, and lastly that to Philemon. To these, the revelation of John. These are the fountains of salvation, that he who thirsteth may be satisfied with the words they contain. In these alone is proclaimed the doctrine of godliness. Let no man add to them, neither let him take aught from them. This is an important point, just an aside that I want to point out. You'll often hear this language in ancient texts. In antiquity, they were very concerned with adding or taking away text from a work. At least in large part, in antiquity, much text was written on papyri and other mediums which are easily degraded, easily manipulated. There were no copyright laws. It was common that people took one work and added to it. There are many indications in manuscripts that we see of different scribes saying, well, this is a little dubious here, this is a little questionable. But it was a task to really keep a work original and unaltered. So when we read in Revelation and texts like the festal letter saying, don't add to this, don't take away, don't add, he's referring to this difficulty of manuscripts and writing in that time. And then he continues, for on this point the Lord put to shame the Sadducees, saying, ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures. And he reproved the Jews, saying, search the Scriptures, for they testify of me. But for greater exactness I add this also, considering it necessary so to write, that there are other books besides these, not indeed included in the canon, but appointed by my fathers to be read by those who are come of late, wishing for admonition and instruction in godliness. The wisdom of Solomon, and the wisdom of Sirach, and Esther, and Judith, and Tobit, and that which is called the doctrine of the apostles, and the shepherd, referring to the shepherd of Hermas. But the former, my brethren, are included in the canon, the latter being merely read. Nor is there any mention of apocryphal writings. But this is an invention of heretics, writing them to favor their own views, bestowing upon them their approbation, and assigning to them a date, and producing them as ancient writings, that thereby they might find occasion to lead astray the simple. And that's just the section of the letter in which he is focusing on the books we should read. Thought you might like that.